So I came to know God in 1996, and there's a long backstory there. And I don't plan on going into all of it today. But looking back, I realized that God was there all along. He was always there. The evidence that a powerful, loving, patient, enormous God was there watching me was everywhere. It was in nature in the way that the sun lit up the leaves on my favorite climbing tree when I was little. God was there the first time that someone I loved died. And he was there in the dark as I tried to fall asleep. I remember calling out to God lots of times when I was a kid. Somehow, deep down, knowing that God was there and trying to connect with him when I was hurt or scared. But as I grew older, I began to think that people who went to church were weirdos. I avoided staying overnight at friends' houses if their parents made us go to church the next day. I thought they sing songs there. Some of them even lift their hands. Why would they worship that Jesus guy? He's just a backdrop in an MTV video. And what the heck are they so happy about anyway? So about the only thing I really believed in was living life to the fullest. There's a saying that says, life is not a journey to the grave with intentions of arriving safely in a pretty well-preserved body, but rather to skid in broadside, thoroughly used up, totally worn out, and loudly proclaiming, wow, what a ride. And that was me. I thought that living life to the fullest meant partaking in everything this world had to offer. The only thing that kept me constrained was the thought, how much trouble can I get in if I get caught doing this? Which usually led to, how can I do this without getting caught? And I was really good at covering my tracks. I thought it was pretty awesome. The thing is, as I grew older in life, I began to find things that I could see and feel whenever I wanted to. There's so much in this world that promises to make us feel better. And in this culture, we're encouraged to figure out what those things are by experimenting. And that was me anyway. And a lot of those experiments ended badly. But God was there then too, during the darkest moments in my life, the all alone times, when the weight of this world crushed me and I began to question everything. And he was there just like when I was a child, and I instinctively called out to him. Even though I didn't really know him, I prayed and made deals with him, like I'm sure many of you have before. I used to say, God, if you're there, just get me through this. I promise I'll never do that again. And how many times in your life have you called out in desperation to that same invisible and intangible God? A presence that you could almost feel in that moment. Almost. But what I didn't realize then, that there was this thing called the gospel. So in 1996, I heard that gospel. I was at a crossroads in life, like many of us are at certain times, and nothing seemed to be going right, and the path I was on most likely ended bad. Sometimes we wake up entrenched in all this junk that we've gathered and this stuff we've done to ourselves. And sometimes it's not so fun anymore. But who do you suppose was there then? God was there throughout all the other garbage that I put myself through. And this time, not only was he there, but I happened to be in just the right place, at just the right time in my life, to hear him. And this time, instead of calling out and making deals and going on and on and on about how horrible everything was, I was quiet. I was quiet because I was listening, because I heard God speaking. Not audibly. I couldn't actually hear him. I'm not Moses or anything. But I was hearing him in the gospel. John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." You might have heard that verse before. I'd probably heard it too, but that's the gospel. And this time, I really heard it and it made sense. So over the next couple weeks, I hungrily began to discover more and more about what Jesus did and what did all those parables he spoke mean. Sometimes I doubted that knowing God and going to heaven was that easy. It seemed like since I was such a selfish person that I should have to earn my way into his good graces. Then there was another moment, another prayer, and it changed everything I knew about the world, about myself, about God. It changed everything, and it changed me. I'm going to skip ahead a little. So for a few years, I searched for God, grew closer to him, went to church, got baptized. I was changing my life. And I could talk for a whole day about just that alone. But when God really gets a hold of you, it feels like you've completely been reborn again. Everything changes. and how you see things and the way you feel inside and everything. So things were going pretty well now. I felt like I was on track. What I didn't know then was that I had become one of those weirdo churchgoers that I avoided earlier in life. And now my friends and family that weren't looked at me that way. Being a Christian isn't always easy. Have you ever heard the phrase that pride comes before the fall? And it did. And you would think that with all this new knowledge that I had about God, and that sense I was really feeling God, had been baptized, and was doing all these great things that I would have known better. But there I was at another crossroads in life, and this time I chose my pride. I decided that doing things my way was much easier than doing things God's way, so I compromised my faith a couple of times and gave in. And here's the problem with that. Even though I'd been saved through the gospel, I was still a sinner, and when I decided to turn my back on God, even in those few short moments, I suddenly found myself looking back 10 years later wondering how I had fallen so far from what I knew the truth was. But throughout those 10 years, God never left me. I met my awesome wife, Sarah, probably at just the right time. She was a Christian too. And I conned her into marrying me with promises of turning my life around and settling down and coming back to the faith. But she kept me grounded and kept me from really screwing things up. And I was still doing things my way for the most part, though. Then Axel, our son, was born. We built a house. Life moved on. All the while, Sarah patiently waited for me to get my act together. And when our daughter Veda was born, I think God started working on her heart. So as I was off coaching football and drinking and worshiping all of the idols that I'd replaced God with, she began to change her life and started worshiping Him. She blamed me, or she shamed me, into doing what I should have been doing all along and taking my family to church. Being the selfish person I am, we would go to a church for a while, and then I would find something wrong with it, and we would go and find another church. This was really a good plan, because I could keep her happy by bringing her and the kids to church each Sunday, and when people there started to see us as regular attenders, I'd yank the rug out and we'd go somewhere else. See, this way I didn't have to worry about anyone digging into my issues. I could have my cake and eat it too. And this was all going pretty well until we ended up here. I think Sarah's patience with me was growing thin. And I know God's was too. We were going here for a while, and it wasn't so bad. And I knew Pastor Eric from my short adventure playing basketball in high school. He was a coach when I was a freshman. Did you guys know he actually cut me from the JV team? So one night, in the middle of football season, I get home from practice and Sarah asked me how I would feel about having a group from church start meeting at our house on Wednesday nights. No way, I said. And there was probably some colorful language inserted in there somewhere. But I remember at first she looked hurt and disappointed. Then her eyes got stormy and dark. Well, too bad, she said. I've already invited them over. So I knew it was too late and I wasn't going to change her mind, but I think I did my best to push every button she had that night. And ultimately I lost. I conceded this whole thing at our house and wrote it off as something that would be good for her, and I wouldn't have to worry about it since I'd be at practice anyway. And I'd seen these types of church groups before, and usually there's a Bible study, and then they kind of finish it up, and it'd probably fizzle out by the time the season was over, and everything would go back to normal. So the season ends, and there's still church people meeting at our house on Wednesday nights. This irritated me, and it was cutting into my video games and beer drinking time. So once again, Sarah shamed me into making sure that I was around for Wednesday night ministry groups. And so I'd rush home from work and feed the kids and clean the house, all the while muttering under my breath or taking shots at Sarah about how ridiculous this whole thing was. But she wasn't concerned. Her focus was on God, and no matter how much I stomped my feet and threw a fit, I wasn't going to change that. So after a while, secretly, my feelings about getting to church on Sunday and having ministry group over slowly began to change. Instead of dreading it, I actually began to look forward to it. And slowly God was working in my heart again. I felt like a lost sheep being brought back into the fold. My pride was still there, though. This life that I had worked so hard to build, for the most part, was godless. And I knew that getting back on the right path with Him meant that I was going to have to face all those same feelings that I'd never dealt with before. And you can't secretly be a Christian. When you're following the Lord, the people around you notice. And I didn't want all my friends and family to look at me strange again. But God had a plan. I was about to go through a trial, and through that trial, God was going to use my pride and pain for the greater good. It started with our 4th pregnancy. We decided that our family felt incomplete, and that despite our fears about money and how things were going, we're going to have another kid. But 6 weeks into that pregnancy, Sarah miscarried. And this was tough, especially on Sarah. But we knew that God was going to use our pain for something better. A week later, I developed this rash. I figured it was just stress, but this was not a normal rash. My entire body itched. I was prescribed medicine that took weeks to work. I went most of that month without being able to sleep. No sleeping pills or any home remedy helped. Have you ever seen a movie or a cartoon with a crazy person that doesn't make any sense when they talk? They torn out their hair from itching? That was me. But I found that if I drank as fast as I could for a couple hours, I'd eventually pass out. So the lack of sleep and the unhealthy amount of alcohol that I was consuming on a daily basis literally drove me crazy, and I was a wreck. And Sarah eventually put the nix on the drinking, which ticked me off. But I had to figure out another way to deal with the rash. So in desperation that night, I asked God for help. And maybe it was the medicine, or maybe the assurance that I prayed, or maybe it was God, but slowly the rash went away. And I began to see, and I began to be able to sleep again. Here's the thing with that. When I prayed that night, not only did I ask God to help me physically, but I asked Him to help me with everything. In a way, I was finally willing to stop doing things my way and start doing things His way. It was a step in the right direction, but I still had a long ways to go. And there was a lot more stuff that I had hidden away, habits and things that I wasn't willing to let go of yet. Then about a week or so later, I was home with the kids, and they were bickering back and forth. After a while, I had enough, and I slammed the book I was reading down and began yelling at them. So there's this coffee table that we had just gotten from my sister and brother-in-law. The top of that table had a glass top that was about a half-inch thick. It cracked in a spider web when I slammed the book down on it. I started cleaning it up, but the glass top was really big and there were lots of sharp pieces of glass to get rid of, so it was close enough to the kids' bedtime, and I figured I should get them to bed and then come back downstairs and get rid of the rest of the glass. I got it all squared away, and then went to get Beta tucked in. Sarah got home. Axel yelled, "Mommy's home," and ran downstairs to greet her. About 30 seconds or so went by, and then I heard Sarah start screaming. Oh God, the glass, I thought. I made it downstairs just in time to see Axel coming out of the den, and he had run past the coffee table and had sliced him wide open right across his upper thigh. I'd seen cuts before, but this cut was something else. It was deep enough to cut through all of his thigh muscle. And what happens when that happens, it opens up even wider. So imagine two pieces of meat being pulled apart. I grabbed him, I threw him on the floor, and desperately tried to force the two sides of his leg back together to keep him from losing blood. Sarah called 911. There's no feeling that I've ever felt that as compared to the fear that rocked me when I thought that my child was going to die. So there we were on the floor, and I was squeezing his leg and applying as much pressure as I could. And I remember that I was shaking so bad, kind of like right now, that I had to focus on keeping my hands from pulling apart. And so here was my son gashed open, and it seemed to me that this cut was serious and life-threatening. And there was nothing I could do to help him. I was helpless. So I prayed out loud, "Lord, protect my son, protect Axel, be with him now, in Jesus' name help him." And then I realized that Axel wasn't even crying. He was just laying there sort of in shock. And I don't think he even felt the pain. He calmly asked me, "Dad, is this a dream?" And how my heart broke. So when the first responders got there, they asked me to move my hands from his thigh so they could take over. And I was hesitant because I had a death clamp on both sides of this gash. And even though there was blood all over, somehow I expected there to be a lot more. And I thought that if I let it go, all the blood would come spurting out and he would die or something. But they assured me it'd be okay. A cut was huge and deep, but it was on the outside of his thigh, and not a lot of veins running down. There's not a lot of veins that run down there. It's mostly fat and muscle. And I often wonder if God protected my son. It could have been so much worse if it would have been somewhere else. The Bible says that, and we know all things work together for the good of those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. Looking back, I realized that God used all of these trials as a way to strengthen me and assure me that he was faithful and would remain faithful. But even though I finally let go of my pride, I knew I hadn't totally resolved it. I'm weak, and I was pretty sure that I needed something more this time, but God had a plan. What I didn't know is that while I was struggling and trying to figure out how to get back on track, he was working in my dad's life. Ron had heard the gospel. He had heard it at the right time in his life, when he was in the right place. And suddenly my dad, whom I had prayed would come to know the Lord for the last 16 years, was asking me about Christ. And he's got a good story too. His is awesome. And if you want to see how God can affect someone, talk to that guy. So he comes to know the Lord, and I remember him saying, "Why didn't you tell me it was like this before? It's like I'm born again." Then it dawned on me, why didn't I? And why didn't I tell all those friends and family members years ago, instead of letting my pride get in the way? So today, I guess this is my chance to let God use me like I should have so many times before. So here's the truth. There's a way to know God. There's a way to go through the rest of your life on this earth assured that you really do know him. What if you truly could connect with God and know that in his eyes you're okay? There's a way to live life to the fullest that doesn't lead to despair. My prayer is that you've heard the gospel before, that you're in a place right now where you can really hear it and begin to understand it. For God so loved the world, you, us, that he gave his only Son, Christ, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. And that everlasting life can start right now. Whether you have him or have known him, you can live life to the fullest, not because you prayed hard enough or did enough good things in your life to earn God's grace. I'm still a sinner and a hypocrite. But through taking one simple step and believing in him. Christ who died on Friday and rose again on this day. Thanks.